this episode, we're going to make AI security policies feel like a practical tool for everyday decision-making rather than a pile of words that people ignore. When you are new to cybersecurity, it is easy to assume policies are mostly for compliance. But the real point of a policy is to remove uncertainty for normal people who are trying to do their jobs. If a policy is unclear, employees will guess, and guessing is where security problems start, especially with AI tools that feel helpful and easy to use. A policy that people can follow without guessing tells them what is allowed, what is not allowed, what must be approved, and what to do when they are unsure. It also creates consistency, so different teams do not invent different rules that conflict with each other. For the AI Security Manager, AAISM, exam, policies matter because they are one of the main ways governance decisions become real behavior across an organization. By the end, you should understand what makes a policy usable, how to write policy statements that can be enforced and proven, and how to avoid the common traps that make policies ineffective. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good AI security policy starts with clarity about purpose, because people follow rules more reliably when they understand what problem the rule is solving. Purpose does not mean long motivational language, but it does mean stating in plain terms that the policy exists to protect data, reduce misuse, ensure accountability, and keep AI use aligned to business goals and obligations. Beginners sometimes think purpose is optional fluff, but it is actually a control in a subtle way because it shapes how people interpret the policy when they face a new situation. If purpose is clear, employees can make better decisions when they encounter edge cases not explicitly spelled out. Purpose also helps leaders defend the policy because they can tie it to risk reduction and trust rather than personal preference. In AI environments, purpose should address the fact that AI outputs can be wrong, biased, or leak sensitive information, and that responsible use requires boundaries. When purpose is missing, policies can feel random, and random rules get ignored. A policy that reduces guessing begins by making the why visible. Once purpose is clear, a policy must define scope in a way that matches how AI is actually used in the organization. Scope should specify what kinds of AI systems are covered, such as internal models, vendor services, and any tools that generate or influence decisions using machine learning. It should also clarify whether scope includes experimentation, pilot projects, and internal productivity tools, because those are common places where risky use appears quietly. Beginners may assume scope should only include major systems, but small tools can still cause harm if they touch sensitive data or influence important decisions. Scope should also clarify what data types and decision contexts are included, because those drive risk and obligations. A common failure is a policy that sounds broad but leaves people unsure whether their tool counts, and that uncertainty leads to guessing. A strong scope statement uses plain descriptions, like tools that generate text from internal documents or systems that recommend actions based on customer data. When scope is clear, employees can identify whether they are covered and what rules apply. The core of writing policies that people can follow is writing requirements as clear, testable statements rather than vague advice. A policy requirement should tell people what must be true, not what would be nice. In policy writing, words matter, and vague phrases like appropriate safeguards or reasonable security create guessing because people do not know what those words mean in practice. Instead, policy statements should specify required behaviors and decision points, such as requiring approval before using sensitive data in an AI tool, or requiring that every AI system has a named owner responsible for ongoing monitoring. The goal is not to write long, complicated rules, but to write rules that are unambiguous. Beginners should understand that a policy is not a training manual, so it should not include step-by-step instructions, but it should be specific enough that the organization can verify whether it is followed. A testable policy supports evidence, because you can show that approvals occurred, that inventories exist, and that monitoring is performed. When policy statements are testable, compliance stops being a debate and becomes a checkable reality. Another critical element is defining clear decision thresholds, which means policies should specify when something requires additional review or approval. Without thresholds, employees either escalate everything, which slows work, or they escalate nothing, which increases risk. Thresholds can be based on impact, such as whether the system influences decisions about people's opportunities, or based on data sensitivity, such as whether personal data is involved. They can also be based on exposure, such as whether the system is customer-facing or internal. Beginners should recognize that thresholds are how you reduce guessing while still allowing work to move forward. For example, a policy might state that low-risk internal tools can proceed with standard controls, but high-impact systems require an impact assessment and governance sign-off. The policy does not need to define every possible case, but it should define categories and triggers that cover common situations. Clear thresholds also support fairness across teams, because they prevent one team from being held to stricter rules than another for the same risk level. When exam questions ask what policies should include to be effective, thresholds and triggers are often part of the right reasoning. Policies also need to define roles and responsibilities at the policy level, not just in governance documents, because people rely on policies to understand who to contact and who owns what. A policy should clearly state that each AI system must have an assigned owner and that the owner is accountable for specific responsibilities, such as documentation, monitoring, and change control. It should also identify who approves use cases, who approves data use, and who reviews compliance and security requirements. Beginners sometimes assume these details belong only in a charter, but policies are often where employees look first when they need to know who to ask. Clear responsibilities reduce guessing because they reduce the number of dead ends in the organization. If an employee knows exactly who to escalate to, risky use can be stopped early and handled properly. Responsibilities also support evidence because approval records and accountability records make more sense when roles are defined. A policy that defines ownership clearly is one of the strongest tools for preventing unmanaged AI use. Data rules are often the most important part of an AI security policy because data is where sensitive exposure and compliance risk concentrate. A usable policy should define what kinds of data are allowed to be used with which kinds of AI systems, and what must never be used without explicit approval. It should also address how data is classified, how it is stored, and how it is retained and deleted. In AI contexts, data rules must consider not only training data, but also prompts and outputs, because both can contain sensitive information. Beginners often forget that copying a customer record into a prompt is still data use, and it can still create exposure if the system stores prompts or if outputs are shared. Policies should also address data minimization, meaning employees should use only what is necessary to accomplish the task, because unnecessary data increases risk. Another key policy element is defining when data must be protected through stronger oversight, such as when personal data or confidential business data is involved. When data rules are written clearly, employees do not have to guess whether a particular type of information is safe to use in a tool. Policies should also address acceptable use and misuse prevention, because AI tools are easy to use in ways that were not intended. Acceptable use rules should explain what the system is intended for, what it should not be used for, and what behaviors are prohibited, such as attempting to extract sensitive information or using AI outputs as final decisions in high-impact contexts without required oversight. This is not about punishing users. It is about reducing predictable mistakes and misuse. Beginners should understand that misuse is not always malicious, because many mistakes come from misunderstanding and convenience. A policy that is usable will include simple rules about verifying outputs, avoiding sensitive inputs, and reporting unexpected behavior. It should also define what happens if someone discovers a policy violation or an unsafe output, such as how to report it and who will respond. Clear acceptable use guidance reduces guessing because it replaces personal judgment with shared expectations. This also supports cultural trust, because employees feel safer asking questions when rules are clear. Another area where policies often fail is by ignoring the reality of change, which is especially dangerous for AI systems that evolve through updates and new data sources. A usable policy should define that meaningful changes require review and approval, and it should clarify what counts as meaningful. Meaningful changes may include new data sources, expanded use cases, model updates, or new integrations that increase access to sensitive systems. Beginners sometimes think a change is only a technical update, but changes in who can use the system or what the system is used for can alter impact dramatically. A policy should also specify that monitoring and periodic review are required, because ongoing oversight is how the organization detects drift and unsafe behavior. When change control and monitoring are written into policy, teams are less likely to treat launch as the end of responsibility. This reduces guessing because teams know that updates are not free, they come with required checks. For exam purposes, policies that include change and monitoring expectations demonstrate maturity and defensibility. To make policies followable, they must be written in plain language and structured in a way that supports quick understanding. Plain language means avoiding dense, legalistic sentences when simple statements will do. It also means using consistent terms across the policy so people do not have to decode synonyms. Beginners should understand that policy is a communication tool, and communication fails when the reader has to interpret what the writer meant. A practical approach is to write policy requirements as direct statements and avoid unnecessary qualifiers. Another important approach is to avoid mixing too many concepts into a single rule, because when a sentence tries to cover everything, people misunderstand it. Policies should also be stable, meaning they do not change every week, but they should still have a clear ownership and revision process so they stay current when regulations or threats change. When policies are readable, people are more likely to follow them, which is the real goal. A policy that is perfect in theory but unreadable in practice does not reduce risk. Policies must also be enforceable, because a rule that cannot be enforced becomes a suggestion, and suggestions create inconsistency. Enforceability does not require harsh punishment, but it does require that the organization can detect violations, respond consistently, and maintain records of follow-up. For AI systems, enforceability often depends on inventory, access controls, monitoring, and training, because you cannot enforce rules if you cannot see where AI is used. Policies should therefore connect to governance routines, such as intake processes for new use cases and periodic reviews to ensure compliance. Beginners should recognize that policies that ignore operational reality often become shelfware, meaning they exist but do not shape behavior. Enforceable policies are designed with the organization's capabilities in mind and are supported by processes that make compliance normal. This is also where evidence becomes important, because enforceability is easier to demonstrate when the organization has records of approvals, training completion, and monitoring results. When exam questions ask what makes policies effective, enforceability and integration into routines are central themes. Finally, a policy that people can follow without guessing should include clear guidance for what to do when they are unsure, because uncertainty is inevitable. Even the best policy cannot anticipate every new tool, every new data type, or every new use case. A simple and powerful approach is to provide a clear escalation path, such as requiring employees to consult the system owner or governance contact before proceeding in unclear situations. The policy should also encourage early questions rather than punishment for asking, because early questions prevent late incidents. Beginners should understand that a culture of safe escalation is part of security, because it reduces the chance that someone quietly does something risky to avoid delay. The policy can also describe how exceptions are handled, because exceptions will happen and unmanaged exceptions become loopholes. When a policy includes a clear path for uncertainty, it reduces guessing by replacing guesswork with a known process. That process is what keeps decision-making consistent across the organization. As we wrap up, writing AI security policies that people can follow without guessing is about clarity, testability, and alignment to real behavior. A strong policy explains its purpose, defines scope clearly, and states requirements in unambiguous, verifiable language that can be enforced and proven. It includes thresholds that tell people when additional review is required, defines roles and responsibilities so accountability is clear, and establishes practical data rules and acceptable use boundaries that prevent predictable misuse. It also addresses change control and ongoing monitoring so responsibility continues after deployment, and it is written in plain language that normal people can read and apply under time pressure. Finally, it provides clear escalation paths for uncertainty so employees do not have to invent rules in the moment. When policies are written this way, they become a daily guide that reduces risk and supports defensible evidence, which is exactly what Task 2 is trying to build. If you can think in terms of policies as clear behavioral expectations tied to governance routines and evidence, you will be ready for the kinds of exam questions that test how programs become real in an organization.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.